Hey guys, this is Vecchio, and today we're going to go over this shot. So creating reflections for this shot in my latest film, In the Darkness. So I just want to preface this by saying that I'm not a 3D guy. I'm a director, so I'm not expecting this to be the best way to do this. I'm sure there's 1,000 other ways to do this that are probably better, but I got the result that I wanted, so I just wanted to share this with you guys, and hopefully it's a technique that you guys can use to expand upon and develop other techniques so that you can tell stories that you wouldn't normally be able to tell. That's the whole point of this, is just to have these skill sets so that you can tell stories that you wouldn't normally be able to tell. So with that said, let's jump in. So we're just going to go over this in Cinema 4D, and then part 2 will be compositing it inside of After Effects. So the first thing you want to do is set up your project settings correctly. So if I hit Control D to bring up my project settings, you'll see here that the frames per second is set to a default of 30, which is not what we want. If you don't set this properly, then your track is not going to work. So remember to do this, set it to 24. Next thing we're going to do is set our render settings up. And so just hit Control B or Command B if you're on a Mac. The only thing we really have to worry about here is the frame rate. So we want to render out at 24 frames per second. We don't need to worry about the resolution because when we set up our motion tracker, so we're going to create a motion tracker and import footage, and so it's going to auto set the resolution, and I'll show you that. So we'll click on the footage tab, and we're going to click on this button here for footage, and we're going to load our shot. Now I took this shot and I rendered it out as a image sequence in After Effects. Sometimes movies don't work, so I just did a very light PNG image sequence. So we're going to open this up, and it auto trims the timeline to the length of the clip. And if we go into our render settings, you can see here that the resolution is set to Ultra HD, which is what I rendered this clip out as. So back to the motion tracker. Now, the idea here is to track the motion of the phone. So there are two things that can be a little bit of an issue. You don't want to track the motion of the camera, because the camera in the shot, if you watch it, it's pretty much staying still. You really want to track the motion of the object in the scene, which in this case is the phone. So I'm just going to take my resampling and bring it up to 100. And basically what this does is it allows you to move around quicker if you have it at a lower resample rate, but since we're motion tracking, the track might not be as accurate if you have a low resampling percentage set. So just bring it up to 100%, and frame start and frame stop are set to the length of the clip. So if your clip is a little bit longer than what you want to track, make sure you enter the appropriate frames, the start and stop, so that you're not over tracking. So I'm going to jump over to the 2D tracking, and I'm going to hit create auto tracks. And what this is going to do is generate auto tracking points, where Cinema 4D thinks that these will be the best tracking points. Now, first looking at it, there are way too many. So I'm just going to take my mouse and click and drag and circle the ones I don't want and hit delete. And I'm just going to go through and circle the ones that I don't want and just delete them. Now remember, we're tracking the phone screen, so we don't need anything over here, and that's going to throw off our track, so we just want to get rid of it. So just go through and delete all the ones that we don't need. And on these tracking points, there are just too many here, so I can just kind of go through and just delete the ones that I know I don't need. And I'm going to keep a couple extra ones just for the hell of it. So now we have a lot fewer tracking points. I'm actually going to get rid of a couple more here. Now the thing with these tracking points is that they might not survive the entire track. And basically what I mean by that is that some of them die off because they just can't hold on to the track, and that's why it generates so many, is so that the other ones can pick up where some of the other ones that die left off. I'm just going to hit auto track here and just let it track. So if you look on the lower left, you can see the progress, and it's just going to do its thing. It's going to take a little bit because it's Ultra HD. And one of the things I want to remember is that I want points at the center of these tracking markers. So I want this one, I want that one, I want this one, and that one, and that one. So this is done tracking, and I'm just going to scrub through it to see which ones die off, because like I said, I wanted the points that are in the center of the tracking markers to stay there the entire time. Actually, most of them stayed, which is good, but you can see this one in the upper right that dies off near the end of the footage, and all of them die off on these two tracking markers at the end of the footage. But I need that for a planar constraint, and that's how we're going to generate a plane for the surface of the phone. I'd like to have track points on these tracking markers, so I'm going to do a manual track on those. So I'm just going to go to the beginning here, go to manual track, and I'm going to control click or command click if you're on a Mac, and drop my tracking points here. Now I can just move it into place. So I'm going to put it right in the middle, and then I'm going to put another one here, And I'm just going to drag that into place. Okay, so that's pretty good. And I'm just going to select these two and then hit manual track. And again, lower left, you can watch it do its thing. Okay, so it's done tracking, and we're just going to scrub through just to make sure the tracking markers haven't fallen off. But they look like they're holding on. We want to check the end, and that's pretty damn good. So I'm happy with that. So the next thing we want to do is create an object tracker. And the object tracker is what's going to generate movement in the object rather than movement of the camera. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So I'm just going to go to the motion tracker. You can see that we have manual tracks, which are these two that I did, and automatic tracks, which are all these other tiny points. So we want to select all of them. So just draw a circle, and that'll select all of them. And I'm going to go over to the object tracker, and I'm going to hit the tracker tab and then assign selected. And basically what that's saying is you're going to copy over all the tracks that we selected from the motion tracker into the object tracker. Assign selected, and you can see that all these tracks are now copied over. And that's what we want. I'm going to hit reconstruct or run 3D solve for object. And the reason why I'm doing that, like I said before, in the object tracker and not the motion tracker, because you can see reconstruct is here as well, and you can run 3D solver. But if we do it from the motion tracker, it's going to do a 3D solve for camera movement. And like I said, in this shot, I mean, there's a little bit of camera movement because it's handheld, but for the most part, that's not what we're tracking. We're tracking the movement of the object in the frame, which is the phone. So we don't want to run a 3D solver for the camera. There's a little bit of motion in the camera because it's handheld, but the object tracker is going to give us enough of what we need so that that little bit of camera movement doesn't really make a difference. I'm going to run the 3D solver for the object, and that's pretty quick. And now you can see that there's a null object here, and it's kind of locked on there, and that's good. And so if I jump out of this one view, you can see our camera here, and if I just move over, zoom out here, so you can see that these are all the points that are on our object. This is our camera, and if I scroll through this, you can see that the object is moving and not the camera. And that's what we want. Now, one of the things that could be a little bit of an issue here is that if you look at the size of the object, which is all these tracking points, it's much bigger than the camera. But if you look at the size of an iPhone compared to the camera, the iPhone is actually a hell of a lot smaller. So we have to kind of normalize this or bring it into a more realistic scale. On the object tracker, there are these tags that we can add. So we go over to motion tracker tags. And the first one we want to add is a vector constraint. And what this is going to do is give us this line here, and this line is going to measure the distance between two track points, and so we can kind of normalize the scene and bring it down to a more realistic representation of what we had on set. So I'm going to maximize this so you can see it. I'm going to grab this point and drag it over to there, and you can see that in the targets it added that track point. If it doesn't auto add it, you can just click on this and click on a track point and it'll add that. And then I'm going to take this side and drag it onto that one, and that auto added it. And actually that's not the one we wanted because that's an auto target, so I'm going to go after the manual track. That's what the user one is. If you open up the object tracker, you can see that there are user features and auto features. Auto features are the auto tracks that were generated, these little tracking points here, and then the manual tracks are these squares that I put in manually. So that's what the user features are. So you can see if I select them, that those two are the ones that I put in. So user features are the ones I put in, auto features are the ones that Cinema auto generated. So back to the vector constraint. Now I know that between this point on the iPhone screen and this point on the iPhone screen, it's roughly 10 centimeters. And so if we go to length, and I know it says unknown here, we can drop this down to known, and the default is 1,000 centimeters, and that's way bigger than what we had. So that's why this is gigantic. So watch what happens when I bring the size down. I'm just going to bring it down to 100. Now remember, I said 10 centimeters is the distance between these two track points, but I'm just going to do 100 just to kind of show you what's happening. So if you watch the screen, I'm going to enter 100 and it's going to shrink that down. So that's a little bit more of a realistic representation, but I know, like I said before, that between this point and this point, it's 10 centimeters roughly, and that'll get us roughly in the area that we want. So it's going to shrink it down even more. So let's do 10. And you can see that that's a hell of a lot smaller, and it's a more realistic representation. If you put an iPhone next to a camera, this is more realistic than when this was set at 1,000 centimeters. So that basically normalizes the scene and brings it down to a more realistic representation of what we had on set. With that done, I'm going to add another motion tracker tag to the object tracker, and we're going to do a planar constraint, and it gives us this triangle. Now, the planar constraint allows us to create a plane based on 3 tracking points. So we want to choose tracking points that are solid and there the entire time, and so that's why I said I wanted tracking points in the middle of these tracking markers that survive the duration of the entire clip, so that we can link this planar constraint to those points. So I'm just going to drag these points onto the surface, and you can see that what this is doing is creating this triangle which is aligned to the surface of the iPhone. And you can see here that we have these selections, which are these 3 track points. Now ideally you want to use green ones because the red ones are, according to Cinema, not as accurate. So I know that this one is not so accurate, so I'm actually going to take that off of there. And I know that this is accurate because this is the tracking point that I generated. And so now we're using 3 green ones. I think it still would have worked if I used that one, but this is, ideally if we can use green tracking points, then that's what we're going to do. And you can see here as I scroll through that those are locked to the tracking points, and it's actually created this plane that is aligned with the surface of the iPhone. Now, it actually hasn't generated the plane yet. It's just that these 3 points are locked onto the surface, and it's going to use those 3 points to generate a plane once I click this button here. So once I do that, it's done it. It doesn't show up because you have to select it. And there you can see that there's a plane attached to the surface of the iPhone. And as it rotates, you can see that it's rotating as if it was locked onto that surface. Now, the thing is that it's not in the right position. So what I'm going to do is move it around so that it is in the right position. Now, when you do this, you have to be very careful, because if you use the wrong axis, then you're going to push it off of the surface of the iPhone, and we don't want that. So don't move it along the y-axis, because you're going to push it off of the surface, and then the track is going to be wrong. What we want to do is move it along the surface of the iPhone. So we can use the x-axis and the z-axis for that. So you can see here that as long as we do this or we do this, it still stays locked on to the iPhone screen. If we move the y-axis, now you can see that it's not, the track is a little bit off, it's sliding, and that's because we're changing the depth location of the plane. So I'm just going to undo that. Scrub through, just make sure everything is good. All right, so when I line this up, I want to take this plane. The easiest way to do it for me anyway is to align the center of the plane to the center of the iPhone. So we're just going to slide this along here and move that, and I'm looking at this point here, so I'm just going to center that up roughly. Now I want to rotate this as well, because obviously the rotation is wrong here. So again, you don't want to rotate it on the x-axis or the z-axis, because it's going to push it off of the screen. So we want to rotate it along the surface of the iPhone, and the only axis we can do that with is the y-axis. So you can see that that's just rotating on the surface of the phone. I'm just going to get it roughly into the right place. What I ideally want to do is scale this up so that it's bigger than the screen of the iPhone, because just in case there's any slippage, I mean, there shouldn't be, but just in case there's any kind of movement, we'll be able to, have a little bit of an edge to cover us, but there shouldn't be, and we shouldn't really have to rely on that. I'm just going to make it bigger just in case. This allows us a little bit more freedom inside of After Effects once we render it out and place it inside of After Effects. So I'm just going to scale it up to be a little bit bigger than the iPhone screen. In addition to what I just said about giving us a little bit of flexibility in After Effects, your concern might be that, okay, well, then it's going to overshoot and it's going to end up onto the case of the phone. But because we're going to be placing this reflection layer underneath the footage, we're just going to key out the green, and then we can place this reflection plane underneath the footage. Whatever excess we have on the edges is going to be hidden underneath the footage and underneath the case or the frame of the iPhone screen. So we're going to scale this up just to kind of cover us, and I'm just going to move it again along the surface of the iPhone just to kind of give us a little bit of symmetry between this side and this side of how much extra on the sides that we have of the plane. That's good because that's going to cover it. I'm just going to make this just a little bit bigger, and as I scrub through this, you can see that that is now locked onto the surface of the iPhone. So when she rotates the phone, you can see that the plane is rotating with it. And if I jump back out and I zoom in here and we look at our plane, you can actually see that there's 3D rotation happening when she rotates the phone. So this is exactly what we want. Now, in order to get reflections, we're going to have to add a reflective material onto this plane. So we'll create a new material, drop it on, and double click to open up these settings. We're going to take the color off because we don't want any color. We just want the reflection. And we're going to add one of these presets. I'm going to use this one. One of the settings here is called roughness. And what that does is kind of blurs the reflection because it's basically saying that the surface is not smooth. It's a little rough. When you have a bumpy or a rough reflective surface, it kind of blurs the reflection a little bit and doesn't make it clear. Now the iPhone screen obviously is a smooth surface, so we're going to turn roughness all the way down, and that's what it was set at default, but I just wanted to point out that setting. And the reason why we're not doing this inside of Cinema and we're going to do it inside of After Effects because we have more control there and we get to see what it all looks like composited together. So we don't need to blur it inside of Cinema. We can just do that inside of After Effects, and that gives us a little bit more creative freedom. That's all set up, but now we need to give it something to reflect. So we need to reflect the room. So what I'm going to do is create a new material, and I'm going to jump out here and zoom out on this view, and I'm going to create another plane. Now, ideally, you'd probably want to do this with a environment, but I didn't have a 3D camera on set, so I don't have one of those 360 cameras, I should say. So I just had my iPhone, and so I used that. So what I'm going to do is actually generate a plane. And again, this is not the best way to do it, but it works. And I'm going to move it up and push it over. And I'm going to rotate it so that it's facing the screen here. So if you zoom in here, you can see that the screen is facing up. And so if we follow where it's facing, we want it to see this plane here. That's pretty good. That's in a good position. So I'm going to take this material that we created and drop this onto the plane. And that's going to be, let's start naming things here. So this is going to be the room image. And this plane here is our iPhone screen. So we're going to name this phone screen. And I'm going to modify this material that's on the room image plane. Bring up the properties. I'm going to turn off reflectance because I don't want it to reflect anything. I want it to just be a reflection of the room without any glare or reflection from lights or anything like that. I'm going to keep the color channel active, but instead of the color, I'm going to come over here to texture and load a texture. So this will use the image as the texture instead of using the color. So this reflection image is something that I generated in After Effects, and it's generated from the last shot of the film. So I put this ghost head in here and I stretched it out so it looks a little bit more creepy. The background is just a panorama I took with my iPhone on set. So it's a panorama shot I took with my iPhone. Now ideally you want to get a wide and large panorama of the set, and that's both horizontally and vertically. Like I said, I didn't have one of those 360 cameras or 180 cameras, so for the purposes of what we were doing in the film, this worked out fine. So if we go and take a look at the asset that I took, it's basically a still image taken by my iPhone. I laid on the floor and I took a panorama shot of the room, and you can see the light in the background over there. I laid on the floor and took a panorama shot of the room, and I thought that that would give me enough space so when she tilted the phone, you can get more of the room in the shot. This worked out well for what I was doing, so that's fine. Now I'm going to render this and nothing shows up. And the reason for that is because the room image plane has no light on it. So we need to create a light, and I'm just going to move it. Now, if I move it up, you can see the reflection in the surface of the phone. You can turn that off, but I'm just going to move it out this way so it's not reflecting anything on the phone screen. So over here is fine. That should give us enough clearance on the screen so we don't get any weird glare on the phone screen. And then I'm going to turn up the intensity of the light to 300 temporarily. What that's going to do is shine more light on this surface. Now, from the top view, I'm just actually going to change this to perspective and then change the shading so I can actually see what's on that surface here. And you can see that because I changed the intensity of the light, it actually made that a hell of a lot brighter. Now, of course, 300 is too bright, but the reason why I'm going to do that is because when I hit render, I can see it better. And also, as I scrub through it, there are certain times when the actual plane falls off, so you can see a hard edge here. And so that's why I wanted to bring up the intensity of the light. So I'm going to go with a green just to kind of see it better in the darkness here. Of course, I could add a background, but I'm just going to do it this way. One of the issues is that when she tilts the phone, you might actually fall off the side of the plane here, this room image plane. In order to double check this, I'm just going to create a render region and make sure that this view is selected. I'm going to select interactive render region, and I'm just going to put this around the phone screen. So now we can see that region, and as we move this, it'll just render it. Now, it doesn't render it in real time. You have to kind of click and then let go. But this gives us enough of a preview that we can kind of click through here and see what we're getting. From what I'm seeing, the ghost isn't really showing up. So I'm going to have to take this plane and move it, either scale it down or move it back. So I'm just actually going to scale it down first. And you can see here that there's a hard edge. That's because we're falling off the side here. You just have to line things up. So I'm just actually going to move this around so we don't get that hard edge. And we can probably get away with having a hard edge because it's just a reflection, but we're going to try not to. Ideally, what we want is to get the ghost in the shot. So I know that this is going to rotate there and we're going to see the ghost. So the ghost, we want it to be visible here. And this is not, so we're gonna have to move this around and try to get this lined up right. She's more in frame, and already it's starting to get a little creepy. That makes me happy. As we move around, we just want to make sure that we don't get any hard edges. We have small ones like that, we could probably get away with it, and let's see here. All right, so let's just scale this up a tiny bit. I'm going to stretch it, and you probably don't want to do that too much, but I think it kind of makes the ghost look creepier when she's stretched out that way. We're just going to kind of step through here and make sure that we're not getting any hard edges. Yeah, it's looking good. Now here, this is, I gave myself a little bit of room at the end here. We don't use the footage all the way up into the end, so I'm not even going to worry about this section here. I know we have a hard edge, but we're not even using that portion of the footage, so that's fine. So that's pretty good. I'm just going to step through here just to double check, but that's good. So the way I line this up, and I gave myself a little bit of room at the head and the tail. So the way this actually works is when she tilts the phone up in that direction, you see the ghost. And so we do. Now when she tilts it back the other direction, we barely see it, so it's not there. So that's fine. And that's the way I kind of wanted it to play out. I'm happy with that. So I can just get rid of this interactive render region. But actually, before I do that, I'm going to adjust the light. Now, we added color and we increased the intensity to 300%. So I'm actually just going to knock that down just a little bit and get rid of the color. So we're going to knock the intensity back down to 100. And that's looking pretty good. We're not getting enough light on the screen here. So let's just double check this real quick. Okay, so yeah, we're not getting enough light on the screen. So I'm just going to move this so it's just out of frame, so it's not casting any kind of glare on the screen. And I'm going to move this up closer to this plane. I mean, that's good. Maybe 150. Yeah, so that's pretty good. And we can always change that later in After Effects. We can knock down the intensity. Now that I'm looking at it, there's not enough detail in the face, so let's do 140. That should give us enough detail in the face, and we can, bring that down later. So that's good. We have everything set up. Our light's in the right place. We're getting enough light on the screen. So I'm just going to take off the interactive render region, and we're all set up. So we can actually go ahead and render this out. What I want to do is hit Control B or Command B if you're on a Mac, choose where we want to save it. Now I use PNGs with an alpha channel, and we're going to need the alpha because when we render it, this footage is just for a preview. So the footage is not going to render. So we want an alpha channel so that we have this as transparent around the reflection. PNGs are pretty compressed, so I did a 16-bit, and I think PNGs work perfectly fine for this. But if you really wanted to make sure, you can render out a DPX or something like that, or even a QuickTime movie and choose an Avid codec. But for what I was doing here, PNG is fine, and they're light on the system, so I just did a PNG. And then basically I set that up, and then I added that to the render queue. So I'm just going to open up the render queue. So I'm going to add to render queue, tell it where I want to save it, and all I have to do is hit render. So we're going to do that, and I'll see you guys inside of After Effects. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something. I just want to end this again by saying that I'm not a 3D guy. I'm a director. So this is how I accomplished it, but I'm sure there are probably better ways out there, but this gave me the result that I wanted, so that's fine. And I figured I'd just share this with you guys so that if you wanted to do something similar, you can go ahead and do it. So I hope it was helpful. Once again, this is Paul Del Vecchio. Go check out the short film In the Darkness if you haven't seen it. It's up on YouTube. The link is in the description, so go ahead and check that out. You can also check out the overall behind the scenes, and I'm going to be coming back with the After Effects compositing part, as well as color and lighting and some other things. So stay tuned. Once again, Paul Del Vecchio. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys next time.